Solo, Star Wars. Lucasfilm hired the two filmmakers behind the Lego Movie to make a Han Solo origin story, then fired them with only a few weeks of shooting left. Phil Lord and Christopher Miller came on to Solo, a Star Wars story, fresh off the Lego Movie and 21 Jump Street, and they were exactly the kind of playful, improvisational directors you'd expect from those credits. That turned out to be the problem. In June of 2017, roughly 4 to 5 months into filming, Lucasfilm announced the pair had left over creative differences, which is the polite industry phrase for a firing. Reports from Entertainment Weekly and others said the duo were leaning hard into improvisation and comedy, drifting off the script, while the studio wanted the scripted, more traditional Star Wars movie it had signed off on. Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy brought in Ron Howard to take over. His arrival pushed the budget all the way to roughly $275 million and added about 4 more months to the schedule. The reshoots were enormous. Depending on the source, anywhere from about 70% to as much as 85% of Lord and Miller's footage was reshot. Howard ended up shooting enough of the movie to receive sole directing credit, while Lord and Miller were credited as executive producers. When Solo finally hit theaters in May of 2018, it underperformed badly, becoming the first Star Wars film to actually lose money in its theatrical run for Disney. It's the biggest modern example of a studio yanking directors off a marquee franchise mid-shoot, and almost nobody who watched the finished film realized how late that swap happened. Island of Moreau. One director spent 4 years developing his dream project and was fired by fax after just a few days of shooting. Richard Stanley had poured roughly 4 years into his adaptation of The Island of Dr. Moreau, and it was supposed to be the film that defined his career. Instead, New Line fired him after about 3 to 4 days of filming, reportedly delivering the news by fax. The trigger was a set that had already spun out of control, including hostile, obstructive behavior from star Val Kilmer, and what little footage existed was deemed unusable. The studio replaced Stanley with John Frankenheimer, the veteran director behind The Manchurian Candidate. Here's where it gets strange. Stanley reportedly didn't just fly home. He disappeared into the surrounding jungle, and then, according to the people who were there, snuck back onto his own production, disguised as one of the animal creature extras, hidden under a mask among the cast. Marlon Brando co-starred, the shoot kept unraveling, and the whole thing became one of the most infamous production disasters of the 1990s, later chronicled in the documentary Lost Soul. A director fired by fax after 3 days, who then crept back onto set in costume, is about as wild as behind-the-scenes stories get. WarGames. The director of WarGames lasted just 12 days before the producers replaced him. Martin Brest was hired to direct the 1983 techno-thriller, the one starring Matthew Broderick as a teenager who accidentally nearly triggers nuclear war through a computer. 12 days into shooting, Brest was fired after clashing with the producers. He later described the dispute as a fight over authorial control, saying the producer treated the director like a bricklayer, just there to lay down the shots someone else designed. John Badham, fresh off Saturday Night Fever, stepped in and reshot the film. WarGames went on to become a major hit and one of the defining movies about computers and Cold War nuclear fear. A 12-day exit on a culture-defining hit shows just how fast a studio will move the moment a director and the producers stop seeing the film the same way. Tombstone. The man who wrote Tombstone was supposed to direct it too, until he was fired a month in and the lead actor secretly took over. Kevin Jarre wrote the screenplay and was set to make his directing debut on the film. About a month into shooting, producer Andrew Vanna fired him for falling behind schedule and not getting the coverage the executives felt they needed. George P. Cosmatos was brought in as the credited replacement director, but according to star Kurt Russell, Cosmatos was a ghost director, essentially a frontman. Russell has said that he himself effectively directed the movie, handing Cosmatos a shot list every single night for the next day's work. Russell said he didn't want it known that he was the one calling the shots, so Cosmatos took the public credit instead. Co-star Val Kilmer has backed up Russell's account, saying Russell essentially directed the film, though Kilmer stops just short of fully confirming every detail, so it's best understood as Russell's well-supported version of events. It's a double twist: a writer-director fired, and then a credited director who may have been a stand-in for the movie's own star. By the way, if you're enjoying this, I post videos like this all the time, and a subscribe would genuinely help the channel out. Thanks. Superman 2. A director shot most of a Superman sequel and then got replaced, with much of his work scrapped and reshot by someone else. Richard Donner directed 1978's Superman, and at the same time he shot a large chunk of its sequel, Superman 2. Depending on the source, he completed somewhere around 75 to 80% of that sequel. But Donner was locked in a deep conflict with producers Alexander and Ilya Salkind over both creative control and money. The Salkinds wanted to cut Marlon Brando's already completed scenes to avoid paying him a percentage of the gross box office, a move Donner publicly opposed. In 1979, the Salkinds replaced Donner with the British director Richard Lester. Lester then reshot a huge portion of the film, reportedly needing to direct more than half of it himself in order to earn sole directing credit under Guild rules. Brando's footage was removed from the theatrical release entirely. For decades, fans only knew the Lester version. Then, in 2006, much of Donner's original footage was finally assembled and released as Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut. That's what makes this firing so unusual. It's one of the rare cases where a director shot most of a blockbuster, lost it to someone else, and then, decades later, audiences actually got to watch his version and compare the two side by side. Spartacus. Kirk Douglas fired the director of Spartacus after a single week and handed the epic to a 30-year-old Stanley Kubrick. Anthony Mann began directing the sprawling Roman epic in early 1959. Roughly 1 week into shooting, star and producer Kirk Douglas fired him. Douglas felt Mann was too deferential on set, letting Peter Ustinov shape and direct his own scenes rather than steering the picture himself. By most accounts, the only footage of Mann's that survived into the finished film was the opening quarry sequence. To take over, Douglas hired Stanley Kubrick, then only about 30 years old. One of the most famous early career breaks in film history happened simply because a powerful star, who also happened to be the producer, decided his director wasn't taking charge fast enough. Bohemian Rhapsody. With about 2 weeks of shooting left, the studio fired the director of Bohemian Rhapsody after he kept vanishing from set. Bryan Singer was directing the Queen biopic, with Rami Malek starring as Freddie Mercury. On December 4th of 2017, with roughly 2 weeks of principal photography still remaining, Fox fired him. The studio pointed to a pattern of unreliability, which reportedly included Singer not returning from a Thanksgiving break and being absent for days at a time. Reports also described him arriving late and clashing with Malek and the crew. Dexter Fletcher, who had actually been attached to direct early in the project's development, was brought back in to finish the film and oversee the reshoots. Under Directors Guild rules, Singer kept sole directing credit, while Fletcher received an executive producer credit. And here's the twist that makes it sting. The film went on to become a massive box office success and won multiple Academy Awards, including Best Actor for Rami Malek. A director fired in the final stretch of a movie that then swept awards season shows both how much can still be salvaged late in a shoot and how the credit rules can leave a fired director's name on a hit he didn't finish. Gone with Wind. The biggest movie of its era burned through 3 directors, and the one who won the Oscar barely survived the shoot himself. George Cukor spent close to 2 years in pre-production on Gone with the Wind. Then, about 18 days into actual filming, roughly 3 weeks in, he was fired. Producer David O. Selznick had clashed with him over the pace of filming and the script, and star Clark Gable was reportedly uncomfortable working with him. The firing was so abrupt that stars Vivien Leigh and Olivia de Havilland, devastated by the news, went to Selznick's office in full costume to plead for Cukor to stay. He didn't. Victor Fleming, who was at that moment directing The Wizard of Oz, was pulled over to take charge. But the production was so grueling that Fleming suffered acute exhaustion and was given a roughly 2-week break to recover. To keep the cameras rolling, a third director, Sam Wood, stepped in and directed for about 18 days. And in a quiet act of defiance, Cukor kept privately coaching Leigh and de Havilland even after he'd been removed. The finished film contains the work of all 3 directors, but only Fleming walked away with the Best Director Oscar. 3 directors, a star revolt, and a winner who nearly collapsed make this the definitive, classic Hollywood firing story. Cleopatra. Cleopatra was so far over budget that the studio fired its director, and then fired his replacement too. Ruben Mamoulian was the original director of the 1963 epic. As delays piled up and costs spiraled out of control, the studio terminated him and replaced him with Joseph Mankiewicz. But the bleeding didn't stop there. Mankiewicz himself was briefly fired later by studio head Daryl Zanuck over the runaway overruns, before being rehired to finish the reshoots and the final editing. Cleopatra became one of the most expensive and financially troubled films of its entire era. It's the clearest example on this list of money, not just creative ego, being the thing that ends a director's run, because here the budget alone took down 2 directors in a row. Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz changed directors so many times that the man who guided Dorothy through it was actually the 4th to sit in the chair. Filming began in October of 1938 under director Richard Thorpe, after Norman Taurog had shot only some early color tests. Producer Mervyn LeRoy felt Thorpe was rushing the production and hurting the actors' performances, so Thorpe was fired after about 12 days. George Cukor stepped in temporarily as a creative advisor. He reworked Judy Garland's makeup and costume and famously told her to simply be herself, but he never shot any finished scenes. Cukor left in November of 1938 to honor his commitment to Gone with the Wind, and Victor Fleming took over as the main director. Then, in February of 1939, Fleming was pulled away to rescue Gone with the Wind, and King Vidor came in to finish the picture, directing the sepia Kansas sequences, including Garland singing Over the Rainbow and The Tornado. 2 of the most beloved classics ever made came out the same year and quietly swapped the same handful of directors back and forth, a piece of studio-era chaos most viewers never realize happened. Fantastic Four. The director of the 2015 Fantastic Four reboot says he lost control of his own movie before it ever wrapped. Josh Trank directed the reboot for Fox, and at first the studio wanted his darker, grittier take. Then executives saw his cut and got uncomfortable, and the studio ordered extensive reshoots that Trank himself didn't oversee. Trank has said the film's editor essentially became the de facto director during those reshoots, and that the new pages he tried to write were simply ignored. Reports around the production also described Trank arriving late and clashing with the crew and the cast. This one's a little different from a straight firing. Trank kept his directing credit on the finished film, but by his own account, he lost creative control of it during the back half of production, which is the quieter, more corporate way a studio pushes a director aside without ever technically removing his name. Justice League. A superhero blockbuster lost its director near the finish line and handed the reshoots to the man behind The Avengers, with strange results. Zack Snyder directed most of Warner Bros.' Justice League. Then, in May of 2017, Snyder stepped away from the film following the death of his daughter, Autumn. It's important to be clear here. Snyder left because of a profound family tragedy, not because he was fired. To finish the movie, Warner Bros. Brought in Joss Whedon, who had directed Marvel's Avengers films, to write and direct extensive reshoots. Whedon added a large amount of new material and pushed the film toward a lighter, more comedic tone that sat awkwardly against Snyder's darker vision. Warner Bros. Also mandated a runtime under 2 hours, which meant cutting roughly 90 minutes of Snyder's footage. By some accounts, only a small fraction of Snyder's original material survived into the theatrical cut. There was even a now infamous technical headache. Because actor Henry Cavill had grown a mustache for another film, his reshot scenes required digitally removing the facial hair, with distractingly odd results. Then, in 2021, Snyder's original vision was finally released as Zack Snyder's Justice League. It's the most famous modern director swap, and unlike most stories on this list, the original director's full version eventually reached audiences, letting fans see exactly what changed. Exorcist Prequel. A director shot almost an entire Exorcist prequel, got fired, and then watched another filmmaker reshoot the whole thing, until his own version was quietly released on its own years later. Paul Schrader was hired to direct a prequel to The Exorcist, and he shot nearly the complete film. The problem was tone. His version was quiet and psychological, with far less gore than the producers wanted from a horror brand. So the studio, Morgan Creek, fired Schrader and brought in Rennie Harlin to redo the movie. Harlan reshot the great majority of it, with new sets, rewrites, and a far bloodier approach, and that version was released as Exorcist: The Beginning in 2004. Now here's the part that makes this the wildest firing of them all. In an almost unheard-of move, Schrader's original, abandoned version was later finished and released entirely on its own as Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, in 2005. That makes it one of the only films in history where audiences can sit down and watch two nearly complete versions by two different directors of essentially the same story, and judge for themselves which fired filmmaker had it right. If this was worth your time, consider subscribing so you don't miss any of the future uploads. Thanks for watching.